Good day and welcome to this special discussion on the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunications Authority, ECTEL. As you may or may not know, ECTEL was established by treaty in Grenada on May 4, 2000. We are currently celebrating our 15th anniversary, and last year we launched a series of activities to mark that occasion. We are in Dominica this week to continue those celebrations. With me in the studio, the Managing Director of ECTEL, Mr. Ember Charles, Mr. Craig Nesty of the NTRC Dominica, and Board Member for St. Lucia for ECTEL, Mr. Ignatius Jar. Welcome to the program, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
We'd like, first of all, to start about the ethos of ECTEL. What were the conditions in terms of the electronic environment which brought rise to this organization we now call ECTEL?
You missed that? Well,
thank
you very much. ECTEL was established 15 years ago, as you said, and at that time there was a single telecoms provider. There were some prevailing domestic circumstances and some global circumstances. The domestic one was that the major economic sector in the region was, well, sort of dwindling. Bananas was going down, manufacturing was also under pressure. So there was need to go into the service sector, and telecoms was seen as one of the enabling industries for the services sector. But to do that, one had to ensure it was a modernized sector, there was competition, and you had to comply with the rules of the international arena under the WTO. So these both internal and external factors led to the establishment of a project to reform the sector in the region, which is called the Telecoms Reform Project, which is actually the precursor to ECTEL. And in that project, the countries came together through a loan from the World Bank to establish a regulatory framework to ensure that you have a liberalized environment for the introduction of new providers, or new entrants as they call it then, into the sector, and thus provide expanded services, options for consumers, and set the platform for advanced and improved services at an affordable rate. So essentially this was what, one of the interesting things about ECTEL is that ECTEL is an organization established by a treaty signed by 5 prime ministers. And in that treaty, ECTEL, the countries essentially cede some of their sovereign power to a regional organization to manage the resources of spectrum, which is really what is used for the delivery of wireless telecommunication services. I can speak a little more later on, but this is really the ethos of ECTEL.
Okay, you talk about spectrum, but we'd probably talk about that some more so that people can have an understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about spectrum and issues like that. How is ECTEL structured?
ECTEL is structured with 3 tiers of governance. The first tier is the Council of Ministers, where the ministers responsible for telecommunications are the ones who actually meet and set policy. This policy is really passed on to the ECTEL Directorate, which is made up of a board of directors and a sort of regional secretariat. The third tier, which is the most important part in our view, is the National Telecommunications Regulatory Commissions. These are 5 bodies established in each of the countries, independent bodies with commissioners, and they are the ones who actually implement the policies and the regulations. Sometimes some of the decisions of ECTEL board and ECTEL Directorate are binding on the countries, others are really consultative and they provide opinions to these countries. So in their own right, the NTRCs can actually initiate discussions, they interface with consumers, they interface with providers and so forth. So this is really the structure of, in a nutshell, of ECTEL.
I think it's at this point that we can segue into the NTRC's Dominica Director. How do you operate within the framework of ECTEL, and what are your roles and responsibilities?
Thanks for introducing me. Teresa, NTRC Dominica is one of the 5 NTRCs in the ECTEL regulatory framework. And as ECTEL, as Mr. Charles mentioned previously, ECTEL sets policy and laws and regulations which we basically have to have enacted in our jurisdiction, and we ensure that these policies and regulations are implemented locally. So that's essentially how we partake in this framework. We're also responsible for the management of the frequency spectrum in Dominica. We are the sole entity responsible for managing all of this frequency spectrum in Dominica in collaboration with ECTEL to ensure that all the telecom providers and the radio operators get a fair share of that spectrum, which is a limited resource, and if not managed properly, would have disastrous consequences for the proper propagation of signals in the market.
Thank you, Mr. Jha. The role of the board. We are here for the 73rd meeting of the Board of Directors. How and where do the board fit into this scheme of things?
Good evening, and thank you for having us on the program. The Board of Directors really is the authority that sets the policy for the Secretariat to deliver the services and to create this sort of working regulatory environment. And so we help to set that policy. Of course, taking that directive, some of that directive from the Council of Ministers, who would ratify our decisions. And so the management, which would be the ECTEL authority, the managing director would submit his, and his technical staff would make submissions to the board for consideration, approval of their the finances, technical services, communications, etc. We would deal with these matters at the board. Some of the matters that we are currently attending to would be matters such as net neutrality, which is very much on the agenda of the ministers have been very vocal on that, and we ourselves, in ensuring that consumers are given this sort of protection, but at the same time that we create a convenient and conducive environment for the service providers to operate. We also have been before us matters to do with the new Electronics Communications Bill and matters to deal with the competition and mergers within, or mergers and acquisitions within our space. And of course, we all know of the situation with Lime and the recent acquisition of Flow and the implications in our market. So we are addressing these matters, as well as matters related to what we call over-the-top services, and the matter of the new spectrum licenses, and so that we make recommendations to the ministers, that is the government, so that they can put in place the proper licensing, etc.
Thank you. It's been 15 years. What have been some of the major initiatives that ECTEL has undertaken over the last 15 years?
Well, from ECTEL point of view, I think because we are regional and we attempt to do things in a harmonized way, I would speak to some of the harmonized initiatives which benefit everybody. The way the sector operates, you have, for instance, a segment of services that are regulated. These are regulated through what we call price regulation mechanisms, and in our case, it's a price cap plan. So we have, in the past 15 years, actually implemented 2 price cap plans to regulate services. Unfortunately, we know that these plans sometimes, the sector is moving so rapidly that the plans become almost extant by the time you get them in, but this is something we have been doing. A very important achievement has been the Universal Service Fund, and I think Craig could probably speak to some of what is happening in Dominica. But this fund has enabled a lot of citizens of our country who can't afford certain services to benefit from the advances in technology through initiatives like Wi-Fi, through the development of content to access the internet, and also through subsidized services in a number of areas. I could speak specifically of in certain countries where you have disadvantaged groups like the disabled, where this project has enabled disabled people to access the internet, access ICT services because of the subsidy provided under the Universal Service Fund. We've also been able to manage, I think, successfully our spectrum plan. And again, you know, I would probably get Craig to probably give us a bit more detail as an engineer on the panel in terms of the operation of a spectrum plan in our member states and how it works and so forth. But it is important for our people to realize spectrum, or the electromagnetic spectrum, is a resource our countries own. And this resource is being used to generate benefits for our citizens. And what we do is essentially license the spectrum for use by service providers. They pay a fee, and that fee is being used to really run the telecoms regulatory sector. These are some of the key achievements. Of course, we have trained our teams across the world in a number of specialized areas. We are developing a cadre of highly skilled professionals among us within the entities in ECTEL. And in fact, sometimes we can boast of our own exports. Some of our former employees have been exported to other parts of the world. We have a former director of technical services who actually now works in the Pacific. And so there is a lot of benefits that we can speak of, achievements we can speak of over the past 15 years. Not to minimize the amount of legislation we have actually passed that really causes the system to work better. Regulations dealing with, as I said, universal service, with pricing, with interconnection, with dispute resolution. All of these principles have all been implemented in the past 15 years. I mean, it's quite a lot, and we can probably go into detail if you want to pick off one or two of them. But as I said, especially on the issue of our spectrum management and so forth, you know, it is important that the public understands how this works. And then if Kirk wants to just speak a bit to that.
Okay, we know that ECTEL is the only multi-state regulator known globally. We also know that its membership comprises St. Kitts Nevis, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So that makes 5. Antigua and Barbuda is not in the mix. How so?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that question. But the genesis of this issue has to do with at the time ECTEL was established, and it is public information that among the countries which had significant investments in a telecom service provider was Antigua. The others had investments, but it was easy for them to divest of these interests in the sector. Antigua, for lots of reasons, either couldn't or opted not to at that point in time. So because of that, it would have been difficult for them to be part of the system, because essentially under the WTO rules, you couldn't be involved and regulating at the same time. In other words, you're regulating yourself, so somebody would be at a disadvantage in the industry. So this is perhaps, in a summary, the reason why Antigua hasn't been part of ECTEL. Antigua, nonetheless, has been working with us. We provide advice to them. They involve in our training programs. They involve in our conferences and meetings and so forth. And we are aware that they have patterned a new bill to amend the 1956 or 1915 telecoms regulation, patterned on our new legislation. So we are aware that they're doing something about it, and hopefully Antigua will first of all reform their system, introduce legislation, and eventually become a formal member of ECTEL.
Thank you for that. The Universal Service Fund, USF, and Spectrum Management, 2 of the major areas of operation. From the Dominica perspective, speak to us about the involvement and their activities in this regard, Mr. Neste.
Okay, thanks again, Teresa. In terms of the Universal Service Fund, the legislation giving effect to that fund came into being, I think, in 2009. And we employed a young lady called Miss Urania Williams, who is the Universal Service Fund coordinator. And she has been really instrumental in getting most of the projects that I'm going to talk about done. And one of the first things we did was we did a gap analysis around the island to determine where broadband was and where broadband was not. And using the Universal Service Fund, if I have to go back historically, The Universal Service Fund has always been about extending telephone services, and that's how it was being used in the US and in other developed countries. But NTRC Dominica, from the very beginning, and ECTEL decided that Universal Service Fund should be used to promote and extend broadband. So we were actually leaders in the use of Universal Service Fund in that way. And it's only recently America is now spearheading a drive to use the USF fund to do just that. So in our small island developing states, there are pockets of areas where people do not have access to the internet, either because the terrain is too difficult, or the telecoms provider might feel that it's not cost effective to bring broadband to that area. And based on the gap analysis we did around the island, a few of the places we found out that that was the case was an area called Bells in the interior of the island. If you looked at a map of Dominica, you'd notice the telecom operators ran fiber rings around the coast, because most of our population is situated along the coastal areas, and they sort of neglected putting fiber into the interior. So the people of Bells and people of Concord and Siniku, to some extent, had very sporadic broadband, very poor broadband. And we basically used the Universal Service Fund to bring broadband to those areas as one of our initial projects. And it was very well received. I mean, there are tourism projects, tourism activity in that area that could not see the strides that we're making to narrow the divide between the digital gap, basically, between the developed world and the less developed countries. So that's some of the areas that we have used the Universal Fund in. Moving forward, we're also working on a very big project now with the Universal Service Fund to enhance our 911 service, because what we find is dialing 911 in Dominica is not the most robust service. So what we're implementing is a E911 service, whereby people will be able to call 911 in terms of an emergency. There'll be multiple people handling that service. There'll be a public service access point where people will have access to the latest information pertaining to a particular case. They'll have databases that they can access and give first responder type of response to people in critical problems. And you'll have location services, so they'll be able to determine exactly where you're calling from in terms of an emergency. And that whole system will be coordinated with the ambulance service, the fire service, and the police service. So you'll be able to track vehicles within the country to determine where the closest responder is and deploy that person to the scene of the emergency. So that's another service that we hope to get completely rolled out before the end of this year in terms of the implementation of Universal Service Fund. And I think I just need to mention the botanical garden situation. We had a Universal Service Fund project where we recently launched Wi-Fi in the gardens, and that is again to reduce the digital divide, because our surveys show that our broadband penetration is not as high as we'd like it to be. So we are trying to provide strategic ways in order for the local populace to have access to the internet. And Wi-Fi in the gardens, we found, is one way of doing that. And recently I heard an announcement where the Prime Minister was talking about introducing many more hotspots. So those are other strategies that we'll have to look at to see how we can keep introducing broadband to the society.
Thank you. Mr. Jha, the current environment compared to the one which saw the establishment of ECTEL